We begin this third week of Lent with a reflection on the Gospel of Mark. Although the Gospel of Matthew appears first in the New Testament canon, the Gospel of Mark actually predates the others by more than a decade, making the author of Mark's Gospel the first to proclaim the gospel of Jesus Christ in narrative form. It is evident, in fact, that the authors of both Matthew and Luke's Gospel use Mark as a primary source for their own writing. While we do not know for certain who Mark is, the common conception is that the author of Mark's Gospel was a Gentile Christian, likely with some connection to the Apostle Peter writing to other Gentile Christians in Rome during the time of Emperor Nero's ruthless persecution of Christians. The first half of Mark's Gospel focuses primarily on Jesus' ministry through rose-colored lenses, if you will. Jesus is portrayed as a great miracle worker who feeds multitudes, casts out demons, heals a paralytic, raises a child to life, walks on water, and even has the power to calm the raging storm. As Jesus calls his disciples, they gladly follow one who is so awe-inspiring, powerful, and wise. It is in Mark's Gospel where Peter proclaims with reckless abandon that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. Ironically, it is also at this very point where Mark's narrative begins to take a dramatic turn. Just a few short verses after Peter's bold proclamation, the pendulum shifts. In fact, Scripture scholars refer to what follows as the Markan hinge. From here on, much to the dismay of his followers, the rose-colored Jesus of the first half of Mark's Gospel gives way to the Jesus who begins to speak of the suffering that he will undergo and who repeats again and again the central theme of Mark's Gospel. If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. The second half of Mark's Gospel is filled with a decreasing number of miracles, 3 passion predictions, Jesus' authority being repeatedly challenged, and his ultimate betrayal by Judas. From here, the familiar scenes of Holy Week play out. Jesus prays in the garden, asking God to let this cup pass him by. At Jesus' arrest, all of his followers desert him and flee, and even Peter denies ever having known Jesus. After enduring trial, he is condemned to death, whipped and stripped, crowned with thorns, spat upon, mocked, and ultimately crucified. Even as he hangs from the cross, he is ridiculed by another who is crucified alongside him. The author of Mark's Gospel is leading us on a path of the complete dejection and abandonment of Jesus. There is a brief mention of women looking on from a distance, but at the moment of his death, Jesus is abandoned and alone. In his suffering, he even accuses God of having deserted him. My God, why have you forsaken me? After all he has endured, humiliated and alone, Jesus breathes his last. Of course, we know that there is more to the story, and so does Mark's audience, although he spends very little time recounting the resurrection event. For Mark, the purpose of his gospel narrative has been accomplished. From the opening verse, the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, it is apparent that Mark's purpose is to proclaim Jesus as our hope and our salvation. The underlying theme of the Gospel of Mark is that if Jesus Christ, God's own Son, accepted and endured suffering and death, so too are we called to take up our own cross and follow after him. But how on earth do we do that? How do we, as Christians in a largely prominent upper middle class neighborhood here in Solon, Ohio, take up our cross and follow Jesus? I don't know about you, but for me, it's difficult to imagine what it would be like to be mocked, outcast, threatened, tortured, and even put to death for the sake of my faith. It is unfathomable for me to imagine that my own life or the lives of my children and the ones that I love would be the cost of being able to call myself a follower of Jesus. I sometimes wonder what I would do. What kind of Christian would I be if I were faced with the kind of persecution that the community in Mark's Gospel faced, that so many Christians face around the world even today. Not to diminish our own heartache, suffering, and uncertainty. We each face that in our own lives every day. Just look at the situation we find ourselves now. In light of the pandemic, we surely have our fair share of crosses to bear. But I do think that reflecting on the passion narratives, particularly the Gospel of Mark, presents us with the opportunity to ask ourselves, what kind of Christians are we? Are we fair weather fans who go to God when the going is good, but turn our backs when things get tough? Do we buy into the televangelist gospel of prosperity rhetoric that tells us if we just pray enough, if we're just good enough, or if we just give enough, that good things will befall us and evil will be kept at bay? Or do we follow Jesus' example by embracing our own way of the cross with humility and grace, by assisting one another with compassion and love as we walk together in faith and hope that even in darkest times, the light of resurrection will raise us to new life?